Proofreader, a tale in the manner of Clive Barker. Margot Hillinger had not been paid for honest work in 9 months when the envelope arrived from Vellum and Vane. She found it propped against the door of her studio apartment in Greenpoint, between a takeout menu and a final notice from Con Ed. The envelope was the color of old cream, and her name had been written on the front in a hand so beautiful it seemed almost cruel. Every letter formed by someone who had loved the alphabet the way other people love their children. Inside was a single typed page. Dear Miss Hillinger, your work on the Brodsky translations came to our attention. We are a small press preparing a manuscript for limited publication. We require a proofreader with your particular sensitivity to language. The fee is $12,000, payable upon completion. The work is solitary. The hours are your own. The galleys arrive Thursday. Please be home. She almost threw it away. She had received 11 similar letters in the past year, each one a small cruelty dressed in stationery. The last had been from a publisher in Bushwick who wanted her to proofread a memoir about growing up in Queens. The pay had been $400. She had spent 3 weeks on it and never received a cent. But something about this letter stopped her. The paper was heavy, the ink was real, and the name Vellum and Vane rang a distant bell, like a song she had heard in another life. She looked them up. Vellum and Vane, a small press founded in 1987, specializing in limited editions of literary fiction. They had published 3 books, all now out of print, all now collector's items. The last had been a translation of a Polish poet she had never heard of, and it had sold for $900 at auction. She called the number on the letterhead. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a woman answered. Vellum and Vane. I'm calling about the proofreading position. Margot said. Yes, the woman said. We've been expecting your call. The galleys arrived Thursday, just as the letter had promised, in a wooden box bound with waxed twine. There was no postmark on the box. There was no shipping label. It was simply there on her landing when she opened the door at 7 in the morning to put out the recycling. She brought it inside. She cut the twine with kitchen scissors. The lid lifted with the soft sigh of old hinges. Inside lay a stack of pages, perhaps 400, bound loosely with a single ribbon the color of dried blood. The paper was thick and pale and faintly warm to the touch, as if it had been pressed against a body for a long time before being sent. On top of the manuscripts sat a red pen, a Parker, vintage, with a nib that gleamed wetly, though it had not yet been used. There was no title page. There was no author's name. The first sentence read, "The proofreader sat down at her desk on a Thursday morning in October, and the room around her grew very still." Margot looked up. The room around her had grown very still. The radiator, which had been clanking since she moved in, was silent. The refrigerator's hum had stopped. Somewhere outside, on Manhattan Avenue, a siren had been wailing. And now, there was nothing. Nothing at all. Only the soft sound of her own breath in her own apartment. She laughed. a small, uncertain laugh. Coincidence. The pen was beautiful. The pages were warm. She would do the work, and she would be paid. And she would call her mother in the morning. She picked up the pen. She began to read. The book was about a woman. It was not at first clear who the woman was. She lived in a city. She translated books from languages most people had forgotten. Her mother was unwell. She drank too much wine in the afternoons. By page 4, Margot had stopped breathing. The woman in the manuscript had a scar on her left shoulder blade from a fall at age 7. The woman had a habit of counting the cracks in the sidewalk when she was nervous. The woman had once loved a man who played cello in a restaurant that no longer existed. By page 7, she had set the pen down and walked to the bathroom and looked at her face in the mirror for a long time. And the face in the mirror looked back at her with an expression she did not recognize. The book was about her, not a woman like her. Her. Every detail. The chipped molar on her lower left side. The scar on her knee from a bicycle accident at age 11. The exact phrasing of the last text message she had sent her ex-husband in March at 2:47 in the morning. I am sorry for the woman I was. I cannot promise to be different. It was all there in the pages, written by someone who knew her. She sat at her desk for a long time. She poured a glass of wine. She poured another. Then, because she was a professional, and because she did not know what else to do, she picked up the red pen and began very slowly to proofread. The first typo was on page 2. She woke at 6:14 and made coffee in the small French press her grandmother had left her. Coffee with a single missing F. Margot. Struck it through with the red pen. She wrote coffee above it, the correction tidy and small, the way she had been taught at the Sorbonne in another life. She moved on. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5. It was nearly dusk when she finally stood up to stretch her back. She walked to the kitchen. She thought vaguely that she would make herself a small dinner, a sandwich perhaps, or whatever was in the freezer. She reached for her coat, which was hanging on the back of a kitchen chair, to fish out a tissue from the pocket. Her fingers closed on something flat and rectangular. She drew it out. It was a $20 bill. She stared at it. She had not put a 20 in that coat. She would have remembered. She had not had a 20 in 9 months. She turned the bill over in her hand. It was real. The paper was real. Andrew Jackson stared up at her with his slight, cool mouth. She walked back to the apartment, to the desk. The manuscript lay open to page 2. She woke at 6:14 and made coffee in the small French press her grandmother had left her. The coffee was gone. The page read coffee, as if it had always read coffee, as if there had never been a typo at all. Margot walked back to the desk very slowly. She picked up the red pen. She turned the page. By the end of the first week, she had identified 14 typos and corrected them, and 14 small good things had happened. A check she had been owed for 2 years arrived in the mail. The man at the bodega gave her an extra coffee for free. Her downstairs neighbor stopped playing his bass at 3 in the morning. Her landlord called to say there had been an accounting error, and her back rent was being forgiven. The wine in her refrigerator tasted suddenly like wine she could not have afforded. On the 7th day, she found a comma splice on page 63. She had not spoken to her father in 8 years. He had never been a kind man. She replaced the comma with a semicolon. She wrote a small, careful note above the offending mark. And she felt, as she did it, a strange tightening behind her sternum, a sense that the room around her had once again grown very still. The phone rang. She did not have a landline. Her cell phone was across the room, plugged in. She turned very slowly. The phone was ringing on the kitchen counter where it had been the whole time. She walked to it. The screen said, "Unknown." She answered. Mary. The voice on the other end was old, soft, full of something that might have been weeping, or might have been the beginning of weeping. Mary. Sweetheart, is that you? No one had called her Mary in 25 years, not since she had changed her name at 16 in the courthouse in Hudson. After the divorce, after everything. Margot was the name her mother had wanted. Mary was the name her father had given her before he stopped. Dad? I know I have no right, he said. I know. I read something today. I read a thing in the paper, and it made me think of you. And I thought maybe. She stood in her kitchen in the long October dusk, with the red pen still in her hand, and she listened to her father weep softly through the phone for a long time. When she hung up, she went back to the manuscript. She turned the page. The first death came in week 3. She had been working 12 hours a day by then. She had stopped translating other books. She'd stopped seeing the friends who still called. The galleys had grown warm beneath her hand, warm as a body in sleep. And she had begun to feel that the pages knew her, that they recognized her hand on them, the way an animal recognizes the touch of the person who feeds it. The sentence was on page 1942. The man at the corner of Bedford and North 8th crossed against the light without looking and was struck by a delivery truck driven by Man Chow Ortega, age 43, of East New York. Margot read it. She read it again. The sentence was grammatically correct. Subject, verb, modifier. There was nothing to fix. She turned the page. In the morning, on her phone, the local news showed a photograph of a delivery truck stopped at the corner of Bedford and North 8th. The driver, the article said, had been a Mr. Man Chow Ortega, age 43, of East New York. He had not been at fault. The pedestrian had crossed against the light. The pedestrian was dead at the scene. Margot sat at her desk for a long time. Then she went to page 142, and she read the sentence again very slowly, looking for the error she had missed. There was no error. The sentence was simply true, and her work had been to find the place where the truth could be made otherwise. She had not found it, so the truth had been allowed to be. She understood then what the book was. The book was the future. The typos were the only places where the future was not yet set. To fix a typo was to seal that fate into kindness, a found 20, a forgiven debt, a father's voice on the phone. But the sentences without errors were the rest of the world. The deaths, the illnesses, the small, ordinary cruelties. Every page she failed to correct was a page that was simply allowed to be. Margot Hillinger looked down at her hands, which were trembling, and she thought of all the pages she had already turned. She did not sleep that night. She read backward through every page she had already proofed, hunting for errors she had missed. She found 3. She corrected them. A misplaced only, a tense disagreement, an extra space. And the morning brought news of 3 deaths that did not happen. A fire on West 23rd that was put out before it spread. A subway car that did not derail. An old woman in Astoria who woke from her sleep and did not, after all, fail to wake. It was a kind of mathematics. Margot understood now. Every error fixed was a life saved. Every error missed was a life spent. But there were so many pages. There were so many pages, and there was only one of her. And the manuscript she saw now, holding it up to the lamp, was thicker than it had been when it arrived. The wooden box on the floor had filled itself with new pages while she slept. The book was being written faster than she could read it. She began then the work in earnest. She did not eat. She did not bathe. She drank only water, and only when the dryness in her throat made the words on the page begin to blur. She read. She read. The red pen grew warm in her hand, and the ink, she noticed at some point in the second week, had begun to darken, to take on the color and the smell of something that was not quite ink anymore. She did not stop. She corrected a dangling modifier on page 218, and a child in Queens did not drown in a backyard pool. She corrected a faulty parallelism on page 256, and a woman in Riverdale did not take the pills she had been hiding in her sock drawer for 7 months. She corrected a single misspelled name. Yusuf should have been Yusuf, a single vowel. And a young man in Crown Heights was not killed by a bullet that had been meant, the paper said the next day, for someone else. She wept as she worked. She had not known she could weep this much. And still the pages came. And still, on every page there were sentences without errors, sentences that were already true. And these she could only turn past, knowing as she turned them that somewhere in the city, somewhere in the world, a death was being allowed to happen because she had not been quick enough to find a way to stop it. On the 41st day, she came to the sentence. It was on page 618. The manuscript by then was nearly the size of a child. She had been awake for 90 hours, perhaps 100. Her hands had begun to shake so badly she could barely hold the pen. Sentence read, Margot Hillinger died at her desk in her apartment in Greenpoint on the morning of December the 3rd, with the manuscript open before her and the red pen still in her hand, and there was no one to find her for 9 days. She read it. She read it again. She looked for the error. She looked for any error, a comma, a misplaced modifier, a weak verb, anything. The sentence was clean. The syntax was perfect. The sentence was exactly the sentence it needed to be in order to come true. Margot Hillinger sat very still at her desk in her apartment in Greenpoint, and the room around her was already growing still, in the way it had grown still on the first morning. And she understood that she had perhaps 2 hours, perhaps less, before the sentence completed itself. Margot Hillinger sat very still at her desk in her apartment in Greenpoint, and the room around her was already growing still in the way it had grown still on the first morning. And she understood that she had perhaps 2 hours, perhaps less, before the sentence completed itself. She thought briefly of leaving, of standing up and walking out of the apartment and never coming back. But she knew, the way she had come to know so many things about the manuscript, that the sentence would simply find her wherever she went. At her desk, the book had specified the desk. The book had specified the morning. She could not unmake what was already written about her, any more than she could unmake the deaths she had failed to prevent. But there was, she realized slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth. There was one thing she had not yet tried. She had spent 40 days correcting. She had not yet tried to introduce an error. The pen was warm in her hand. The ink in it was no longer ink. She looked down at the sentence. Margot Hillinger died at her desk. And she lifted the pen very carefully, and she made the smallest possible change. She struck out the D in died. She replaced it with an R. Margot Hillinger, ride at her desk. It was nonsense. It was nothing. It was not even a word. It was the kind of error she would have corrected on any other page without a second thought. She set the pen down. She waited. The room did not grow still. The radiator clanked. Somewhere outside on Manhattan Avenue, a car horn sounded. A pigeon landed on the fire escape and made a small, soft sound against the window. Margot Hillinger did not die. She sat at her desk for a long time, breathing, listening to the small, ordinary sounds of a small, ordinary world. And she felt the manuscript beneath her hand grow cool. Cool as a body that has been left alone for some time. And the pen in her other hand grew cool also. And the ink, when she looked at it, was only ink again. She turned the page. The next sentence read, "The proofreader had at last understood the nature of her work, and from that morning forward she labored at it without rest, and she introduced errors where the world required them, and she corrected errors where the world required that also, and she became, in the long quiet of her labor, the hidden hand at the back of every kindness and every survival. And her name was forgotten by the world she preserved, and she did not mind. Margot read the sentence twice. She picked up the pen. She did not change anything. She turned the page. The apartment on the second floor of a building in Greenpoint is still rented to a woman named Margot Hillinger. The mail is collected. The rent is paid. The light in the window burns through the night, every night, and has burned every night for as long as anyone on the block can remember. If you live in the city, and you have ever crossed a street at the wrong moment and lived, or taken a pill you should not have survived and woken in the morning, or heard the phone ring with the voice of someone you thought you had lost forever, it is possible that somewhere in a room you will never see, a woman with a red pen has chosen your sentence. She is very tired. She does not rest. She has been waiting a long time for someone to relieve her. The press is called Vellum and Vein. The galleys are sent out by mail. They will arrive in a wooden box bound with waxed twine, and the pen inside will be beautiful, and the fee will be more money than you have ever been offered for a single piece of work. You should be home on a Thursday. You should be ready to begin.